Sunni Islam. Sunni Islam is the largest denomination within Islam, comprising approximately 85 to 90% of the world's 1.8 billion Muslims, a division that emerged immediately after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE over the question of rightful succession to leadership of the Muslim community. The name derives from al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, meaning the people of the tradition and community, reflecting their adherence to the Sunnah, the recorded traditions and practices of Prophet Muhammad, preserved in 6 major Hadith collections considered authentic by Sunni scholars. Sunnis believe the first 4 caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, were the rightly guided caliphs whose leadership was legitimate, accepting that the caliphate should be determined through community consensus rather than hereditary succession through the Prophet's bloodline. The Sunni tradition encompasses 4 major schools of jurisprudence, known as madhabs, including Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, each offering slightly different interpretations of Islamic law while remaining within orthodox boundaries. Sunni Muslims form the majority population across vast geographic regions, including the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, with countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, and Indonesia having predominantly Sunni populations. The tradition emphasizes community consensus, known as ijma, and analogical reasoning, called qiyas, as supplementary sources of Islamic law alongside the Quran and Hadith, creating a flexible framework for addressing new situations while maintaining core principles established during Islam's founding era. Shia Islam. Shia Islam represents the second largest Islamic denomination, comprising approximately 10 to 15% of Muslims worldwide, with estimates suggesting between 180 and 200 million adherents, a tradition rooted in the belief that Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, was the rightful successor, designated by divine appointment rather than community election. The fundamental theological distinction centers on the concept of imamate, with Shias believing that leadership of the Muslim community should pass through the Prophet's family bloodline via Ali, and that these imams serve as divinely appointed, infallible interpreters of Islamic law and spiritual guides. The majority of Shias belong to the Twelver tradition, which recognizes a succession of 12 imams beginning with Ali and ending with Muhammad al-Mahdi, who according to Shia belief went into occultation in 874 CE and will return as the Mahdi to establish justice before the Day of Judgment. Shia Islam dominates in Iran, where 90 to 95% of the population follows this tradition, and forms majorities in Iraq, Bahrain, and Azerbaijan, with significant minority populations in Lebanon, Yemen, Pakistan, and India. The annual commemoration of Ashura marks the martyrdom of Hussein ibn Ali, the Prophet's grandson, who was killed at the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE, an event that crystallized Shia identity and remains central to Shia religious consciousness through mourning rituals and passion plays. Shias utilize different Hadith collections than Sunnis, most notably the 4 books, and maintain distinct legal rulings, including the practice of temporary marriage known as muta, which Sunni jurisprudence prohibits. Ibadi Islam. Ibadi Islam represents the oldest surviving Islamic sect from the earliest period of Islamic history, emerging in the 7th century from the Kharijite movement that arose during the First Fitna, the first Islamic civil war following the Battle of Siffin in 657 CE, though Ibadists represent a more moderate strain than the original Kharijites, who gained notoriety for their extreme positions. With approximately 2 to 3 million adherents globally, Ibadists constitute a small but historically significant minority, maintaining an independent theological and jurisprudential tradition for nearly 1,400 years, despite pressure from larger Sunni and Shia populations. The sect takes its name from Abdullah ibn Ibad, an early leader who helped shape Ibadi thought, though the actual founder is considered Jabir ibn Zaid, a scholar from Basra who lived in the 7th century. Ibadis rejected both Ali's claim to the caliphate and his opponent's positions after the Battle of Siffin, instead maintaining that leadership should be determined solely by personal piety and religious merit rather than tribal affiliation or family lineage, accepting only the first 2 caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar, as legitimate. Today, Ibadis form the majority population in Oman, comprising approximately 75% of the country's inhabitants, with smaller communities surviving in Zanzibar. So, the Nafusa Mountains of Libya and the Mazab region of Algeria, where they have maintained distinct cultural and religious identities despite centuries of marginalization. Ibadi jurisprudence combines elements from various Islamic legal traditions while maintaining its own distinctive interpretations, and their mosques typically feature simple, unadorned architecture, reflecting their emphasis on moderation and their historical opposition to the elaborate displays of wealth they associated with corrupt leadership. Sufism. Sufism represents the mystical dimension of Islam that exists across both Sunni and Shia traditions, emerging between the 8th and 9th centuries as practitioners sought direct personal experience of the divine through inner spiritual development, rather than relying solely on external religious observance. With estimates suggesting that several 100 million Muslims worldwide incorporate Sufi practices into their faith, though exact numbers remain contested due to Sufism's integration within broader Islamic practice. The tradition emphasizes purification of the soul, love of God, and the remembrance of the divine through practices called dhikr, which involve repetitive chanting of God's names, rhythmic breathing exercises, and in some orders, ecstatic dancing, such as the whirling performed by the Mevlevi order, founded by followers of the poet Rumi, who lived from 1207 to 1273, and whose works remain among the most widely read spiritual poetry in the world. Sufis organize themselves into tariqas, or spiritual orders, each led by a sheikh or pir who traces their spiritual lineage back through generations of masters to the Prophet Muhammad, or Ali ibn Abi Talib, with major orders including the Qadiriyya, Naqshbandiyya, Chishtiya, and Mevlevi, each maintaining distinct practices and emphasizing different paths to spiritual enlightenment. The tradition incorporates music, poetry, and art as vehicles for spiritual expression, with famous Sufi thinkers like al-Ghazali, who lived from 1058 to 1111, and Ibn Arabi, who lived from 1165 to 1240, developing sophisticated philosophical frameworks that reconciled mystical experience with orthodox Islamic theology. Sufism played a crucial role in spreading Islam peacefully across Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia through the charismatic teachings of Sufi saints and the appeal of their devotional practices. Though the veneration of saints at their shrines has drawn criticism from reformist movements like Salafism that view such practices as innovations contradicting pure monotheism. Salafi Movement. The Salafi movement represents a modern reform tendency within Sunni Islam that emerged in the late 19th century, calling for a return to the practices of the Salaf, the first 3 generations of Muslims, including the Prophet Muhammad's companions and their immediate successors, whom Salafis view as exemplifying pure Islamic practice, before later innovations allegedly corrupted the faith. The movement draws intellectual inspiration from medieval scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, who lived from 1263 to 1328, and the 18th century Arabian preacher Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who lived from 1703 to 1792 and founded the Wahhabi movement in alliance with the House of Saud, establishing a puritanical interpretation of Islam that became the official religious doctrine of Saudi Arabia after the kingdom's establishment in 1932. Salafists emphasize a literal interpretation of the Quran and Hadith, while rejecting centuries of accumulated Islamic jurisprudence and theology they consider corrupted by foreign influences. Opposing Sufi mysticism, the veneration of saints, intercession through religious intermediaries, and philosophical theology in favor of what they view as pure monotheism called Tawheed. Contemporary scholars estimate between 50 and 100 million adherents globally, though precise numbers remain difficult to determine because Salafism represents a theological orientation rather than a formal sect with membership rolls, and many Muslims adopt Salafi positions on certain issues while maintaining traditional practices in other areas. The movement encompasses three main orientations, according to researchers. Purist Salafis, focused on education and personal piety. Activist Salafis, engaged in political organizing. And jihadist Salafis, who believe violence is necessary to establish Islamic governance, though the vast majority of Salafis reject terrorism and operate within legal frameworks. Salafi influence expanded dramatically following the 1979 Iranian Revolution, as Saudi Arabia invested billions in spreading Wahhabi-influenced Salafi interpretations globally through mosques, schools, and media, fundamentally reshaping Islamic discourse in many regions and creating tensions with traditional Sunni practices. Ahmadiyya. The Ahmadiyya movement was founded in 1889 by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad in Qadian, British India, claiming he was the prophesied Messiah and Mahdi whose advent was foretold in Islamic tradition, a claim that sparked immediate controversy because mainstream Islamic theology holds that Muhammad was the final prophet and no prophet could come after him, making Ahmadi's prophethood claims fundamentally heretical to Orthodox Muslims. The movement currently claims between 10 and 20 million members worldwide, though these figures are disputed by critics who suggest lower numbers, with significant populations in Pakistan, India, Indonesia, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the United States. Organized under two main branches following a 1914 split. The larger Ahmadiyya Muslim community, led by a caliph headquartered in London, and the smaller Lahore Ahmadiyya movement that interprets Mirza Ghulam, Ahmad's role less literally. Ahmadis emphasize peaceful propagation of Islam, reject violent jihad, promote interfaith dialogue, and have translated the Quran into numerous languages while establishing mosques in over 200 countries through aggressive missionary activity, yet face severe persecution in many Muslim-majority nations. Pakistan's constitution formally declared Ahmadis non-Muslim in 1974 through a constitutional amendment, prohibiting them from calling themselves Muslims, using Islamic terminology, or performing Islamic practices publicly under penalty of imprisonment. While Indonesia has banned the movement, and violent mobs have attacked Ahmadi communities, the movement's organizational structure includes elected leadership, systematic record-keeping, and coordinated global activities, including humanitarian relief efforts and educational institutions, demonstrating effective modern religious organization while maintaining strict internal discipline. Despite theological rejection by mainstream Islam, Ahmadis consider themselves Muslims and practice the 5 pillars, while adding belief in Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's prophetic status, creating an irreconcilable theological divide that results in their marginalization and persecution across the Muslim world. Alawites. The Alawites, also known as Alawis or Nusayris, represent a syncretic religious community that originated from Shia Islam during the 9th and 10th centuries, numbering approximately 3 to 4 million adherents, concentrated primarily in Syria, where they comprise roughly 10 to 12% of the population, particularly in the coastal mountain regions around Latakia. The sect's theology incorporates esoteric beliefs that diverge significantly from mainstream Islam, including the belief in divine incarnation of Ali ibn Abi Talib, reincarnation of souls, and elements borrowed from Christianity, Gnosticism, and pre-Islamic Middle Eastern traditions, making their classification as Muslims contested by many Islamic scholars. Alawite religious practices remain highly secretive, with only initiated men gaining access to the faith's inner teachings through a series of ritual initiations, while women and uninitiated community members remain excluded from full religious knowledge, and the community celebrates certain Christian holidays, including Christmas and Epiphany, alongside Islamic observances. The sect's name derives from its veneration of Ali, though it was historically known as Nusayri after Ibn Nusayr, a 9th century figure associated with the movement's early development. and the community faced centuries of marginalization and persecution under Ottoman rule, which classified them as heretics and subjected them to discriminatory policies. Syria's Assad family belongs to the Alawite community, and Hafez al-Assad's rise to power in 1970 transformed the historically oppressed minority into Syria's ruling elite. A dynamic that has profoundly shaped Syrian politics and became central to the country's devastating civil war that began in 2011, as the conflict took on sectarian dimensions with the Sunni majority rebellion against Alawite-dominated government. The Alawites' secretive nature means much of what outsiders know about their beliefs comes from defectors, historical opponents, or anthropological research, leaving significant uncertainty about their exact doctrines and practices. Druze. The Druze faith emerged in 1017 CE from Ismaili Shia Islam in Fatimid Egypt, claiming that the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah was a divine incarnation, a belief that caused immediate rupture with mainstream Islam and led to the faith's development as an entirely separate religious tradition with approximately 1 to 2 million adherents today. The religion was founded primarily by Hamza ibn Ali, who declared al-Hakim's divinity, along with other preachers including Muhammad al-Darazi, whose name became associated with the community despite his eventual denunciation by other founders, and the faith ceased accepting converts in 1043 CE, making it a closed religion where membership is determined solely by birth to two Druze parents. Druze theology incorporates elements from Greek philosophy, particularly Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and various Middle Eastern religious traditions, teaching belief in reincarnation where souls transmigrate only within the Druze community, maintaining the same number of souls across generations, and dividing adherents into two groups: the Ukal, or initiated who have access to religious knowledge and wear distinctive white head coverings, and the Juhal, or uninitiated who form the majority. The community is concentrated in Lebanon, where Druze comprise approximately 5 to 6% of the population, Syria, where they represent about 3%, and Israel, where they constitute roughly 1.6%, and maintain unique status including mandatory military service unlike other Arab citizens, with smaller diaspora communities in the Americas, Europe, and Australia. Druze do not follow the 5 pillars of Islam, do not pray in mosques, but rather in simple meeting houses called khalwa, and do not observe Islamic dietary laws or ritual practices, leading virtually all Muslim scholars to classify them as non-Muslims, despite the faith's historical origins within Islamic civilization. The community has survived for a millennium through a combination of secretive religious practices, strategic political alliances with various regional powers, strict endogamy that prohibits marriage outside the faith, and fierce defense of their mountain strongholds in Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel. Ismaili Shia. Ismaili Shia represents a major branch of Shia Islam that split from the Twelver mainstream in 765 CE over the question of rightful succession to the 6th Imam, with Ismailis recognizing Ismail ibn Jafar as the legitimate 7th Imam, while Twelvers followed his brother Musa al-Qadim, a division that created two distinct lineages continuing to the present day, with approximately 15 to 20 million Ismailis worldwide. The Ismaili tradition emphasizes the continuing authority of a living visible imam who provides guidance to the community, currently embodied in the Aga Khan IV, the 49th hereditary imam of the Nizari Ismailis, who inherited the position in 1957 at age 20 and has since led the community's modernization and global expansion. Ismailis historically established the Fatimid Caliphate that ruled North Africa and Egypt from 909 to 1171, founding the city of Cairo in 969 and establishing Al-Azhar University, which later became one of Sunni Islam's most prestigious institutions after the dynasty's fall, demonstrating the sect's significant historical influence on Islamic civilization despite its minority status. The tradition divides into two main branches: the Nizari Ismailis, who represent the majority and follow the Aga Khan's lineage, and the Mustali Ismailis, concentrated primarily in Yemen and India, who recognize a different line of imams and are led by a figure called the Dai al-Mutlaq, rather than a present imam. Ismaili theology emphasizes esoteric interpretation of the Quran alongside its literal meaning, distinguishing between zahir, the exoteric or apparent dimension, and batin, the esoteric or hidden dimension that requires the imam's guidance to understand properly. And this emphasis on mystical interpretation historically aligned Ismailis with philosophical and scientific inquiry. The Aga Khan Development Network, established by the current imam, operates hundreds of schools, universities, hospitals, and development projects across Asia and Africa, emphasizing education, healthcare, and economic development as religious imperatives. Zaidi Shia. Zaidi Shia represents a distinct branch of Shia Islam, named after Zaid ibn Ali, who lived from 695 to 740 CE, and led an unsuccessful uprising against the Umayyad Caliphate in Kufa, Iraq, a rebellion that established the theological principles distinguishing Zaidis from other Shia groups through their emphasis on active resistance against unjust rule, rather than quietist waiting for a hidden imam. With approximately 8 to 10 million adherents concentrated primarily in Yemen, where they comprise roughly 35 to 40% of the population, Zaydis represent the Shia branch closest to Sunni Islam in theology and practice, making them a bridge between the two major Islamic traditions. Unlike Twelver Shias, Zaydis do not believe in the occultation of a hidden imam or in the infallibility of imams. Instead, maintaining that any learned descendant of Ali and Fatima, who publicly claims the imamate through action and possesses the necessary religious knowledge and military capability, can become imam, requiring the imam to be a visible political and military leader rather than a spiritual figure in hiding. Zaydis accept the legitimacy of the first three caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, unlike other Shia groups who reject them as usurpers of Ali's rightful position, and Zaydi jurisprudence and ritual practices closely resemble Sunni traditions, including similar prayer formats and acceptance of comparable Hadith collections. The Zaydi imamate ruled northern Yemen for centuries, establishing a theocratic state that lasted until the 1962 revolution overthrew the last Zaydi imam and established the Yemen Arab Republic, though Zaydi identity remained central to northern Yemeni culture and politics. The contemporary Houthi movement, which controls significant portions of northern Yemen since 2014, draws its support primarily from Zaydi communities and claims to represent Zaydi interests against perceived Sunni marginalization. Though scholars debate the extent to which the movement represents traditional Zaydi theology versus a modern political insurgency using religious identity as mobilization. Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam represents an African-American religious movement founded in 1930 in Detroit by Wallace Fard Muhammad, who disappeared mysteriously in 1934, after which leadership passed to Elijah Muhammad, who led the organization until his death in 1975 and developed a theology that mainstream Muslims universally reject as heretical due to its claims that Fard was God incarnate and Elijah Muhammad was his prophet, contradicting Islam's fundamental belief in Muhammad ibn Abdullah as the final prophet. The movement combined Islamic elements with black nationalist ideology, teaching a racial theology that identified black people as the original humans and white people as a race created by an evil scientist named Yaqub, doctrines that served to build black pride and community solidarity during the era of Jim Crow segregation and systemic racism, but diverged fundamentally from Orthodox Islamic theology. Membership estimates vary widely, from 50,000 to 200,000 at various points in the movement's history, with the organization establishing mosques, schools, businesses, and social programs across urban black communities, enforcing strict moral codes, prohibiting alcohol, drugs, extramarital sex, and certain foods while requiring modest dress and disciplined behavior from members. Famous adherents included Malcolm X, who joined in prison in 1946 and became the movement's most prominent spokesman before leaving in 1964 after discovering Elijah Muhammad's moral failings and embracing orthodox Sunni Islam, and boxer Muhammad Ali, who joined in 1961 and remained loyal to the organization through various transitions. After Elijah Muhammad's death in 1975, his son, Warith Deen Muhammad, led the majority of Nation of Islam members into orthodox Sunni Islam, renaming the organization and abandoning the racial theology and claims of Fard's divinity. While Louis Farrakhan split away in 1977 to revive the original Nation of Islam teachings and continues leading a smaller organization maintaining Elijah Muhammad's doctrines. The Nation of Islam played a crucial role in African American history by providing community support, fostering black economic independence, and introducing thousands of black Americans to Islam, even though its theological teachings remain rejected by the global Muslim community. Quranists. Quranists, also known as Quran-only Muslims or Ahl Quran, represent a diverse movement within Islam that rejects the religious authority of Hadith literature, arguing that the Quran alone provides sufficient guidance for Muslims, and that Hadith collections compiled 2 to 3 centuries after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE cannot be verified with sufficient certainty to serve as binding religious law. The movement lacks central organization or unified theology, instead comprising individual scholars and loosely connected communities, primarily communicating through online platforms, with adherents estimated between 1 and 5 million globally, though reliable demographic data remains unavailable due to the movement's decentralized nature and the persecution Quranists face in some Muslim-majority countries. Quranists argue that the Quran repeatedly describes itself as complete, clear, and fully detailed, citing verses that state the book explains all things, and questioning why God would reveal an incomplete scripture requiring supplementary texts transmitted through fallible human chains of narration across generations. The movement gained prominence in the 19th and 20th centuries through reformers like Sayyid Ahmad Khan in British India, who advocated rational interpretation of Islam. Though scholars trace Quranist tendencies back to early Islamic history, when some Muslims questioned Hadith reliability, even as the collections were being compiled. Modern Quranist scholars, including Adib Yüksel and the controversial figure Rashad Khalifa, who claimed to discover a mathematical code in the Quran before his murder in 1990, have promoted Quran-only interpretations through books, translations, and online content, though their specific theological positions vary considerably. Quranist rejection of Hadith leads to diverse practices among adherents, with some praying 3 times daily rather than the traditional 5, others interpreting pilgrimage requirements differently, and many adopting more flexible positions on Islamic law since they lack the detailed prescriptions found in Hadith literature, creating a rationalist approach that emphasizes personal interpretation and individual responsibility in understanding divine guidance. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.